So I've been in hosting for 20 years, over 20 years now, and so I've seen the change in originally dedicated servers and moving to virtual machines, and obviously now serverless and Kubernetes and things. I guess when you look back over time, things were very complicated. There were so many different ways people were deploying things using different technologies. So I think what Kubernetes has really brought is that kind of standardization and that one way of working. Of course, there's different ways of using Kubernetes, but in a way, companies are now starting to use Kubernetes as a de facto way to, run their infrastructure. So I think it's quite a nice step change that it gets away from all these different variations of hosting.
I think, adding to that as well, that we're always striving to be getting to the smallest amount of resource usage, be that CPU or RAM. So with things like virtualization, we've moved away from having physical resources like a server dedicated to a single application. Virtualization with VMware and Zen allowed us to segregate that down and use resources more efficiently. And with containerization, we're going a step further. And Kubernetes is a great way of managing those containers and is really the de facto standard now for making sure that you can get your workload running as smoothly as possible.
I guess, coming back to my point before, I think the standardization is probably the main thing. I guess for companies, it makes it easier for them to move between providers or work with more than one provider in a kind of high availability setup or something like that.
And one of the main things about Kubernetes and the way that you deploy things with containers and Helm charts and now moving towards operators is it's becoming very cloud agnostic. That goal of being able to run a container on your dev machine and then have that same container run in production. We're moving to that with Kubernetes, where not only is production a single cloud provider or a single set of hardware that you run yourself, you can now host this over multiple clouds, and that same Helm chart is going to run in Google, in Civo, or in Azure, or wherever you go. That's the same standardization.
Yeah, so the first thing we're doing differently at Civo is we use K3S instead of the full version of Kubernetes, and I guess that gives us a few different advantages over our competitors. Firstly, it uses less resources because the installation is a lot smaller. It uses less RAM, less disk space. So that allows us to keep costs down because it's more efficient in terms of resource usage, but also in terms of deployment time. That allows us to deploy clusters in a much quicker time. So we're very much focused on speeding things up and also keeping things very simple for our users. So that developer experience, I think the whole K3S minimal installation and efficiency kind of adds to our message of simplicity and efficiency within Civo.
And Civo, all of the engineers at Civo have been using Kubernetes for 3 or 4, probably even more years. And when we were looking at designing our new platform, Kubernetes was that de facto standard of what to use to do the management of containers. We're also looking at making now VMs containers using the KubeVirt project. So on our supercluster, as we call it, we're running Kubernetes to do all of the orchestration. When customers run up their own tenant cluster, under the hood, that's being scheduled on our Kubernetes-based supercluster. I always say that Kubernetes is hard enough as it is, but we're putting Kubernetes on top of Kubernetes and just calling it turtles all the way down.
So I think our research that we've recently done, we did a survey to 1,000 developers, and complexity was the biggest factor that was slowing down the adoption of Kubernetes. So I think that's, for some teams, smaller teams that have less technical staff, having that knowledge and that steep learning curve is difficult for them. Large companies want a lot more control, so they have the teams to look after Kubernetes and manage that and actually deal with that. But there's a lot of developers out there that just want to ship their code quickly and actually don't want to get too involved with the nuts and bolts of fully understanding Kubernetes. So I think going back to the the K3S thing, that's what we're trying to simplify things and make things easier for people.
Kubernetes has two facets to it, really. That you've got the skill set required to run applications on Kubernetes, and that's vastly different to the skill set required to run Kubernetes itself. Kubernetes is very complicated to run. You've got things like certificate management, you've got etcd at the back end, you've got making sure that your API is highly available. How do you do all that on bare metal, or do you outsource that to a cloud provider? None of this actually provides business value at the end of the day. If you've got a team that's sitting there managing that and making sure that's up and running and staying available, your application isn't getting developed, it isn't getting the love and the time and the attention that it needs. And at the end of the day, that's what is giving business value, it's giving users value. So that complexity and the time required to manage Kubernetes is a real sort of negative side to that. And companies are looking to outsource that to people like public cloud providers like Civo, to take all of that pain away and allowing businesses to develop business value and get users sort of more features out the door.
At Civo, we believe that K3S offers a great opportunity to simplify the Kubernetes experience, make it more efficient for users, allow them to ship code quicker, and reduce the cost. So, Dinesh might add to the fact that it's fully compatible with the full version of Kubernetes. So we've not really taken away any goodness. We've kept the goodness. We've put a Civo wrap around that and made sure it's a fully conformant version of Kubernetes. So I think we feel that we've got the benefits of full Kubernetes, but with the efficiency of K3S.
One of K3S's goals has been to remove stuff from full fat K8s that's not really required by 99% of users. If you go through the code base, there's a lot of cloud specific code in there. So for example, the GCP persistent volume stuff is all baked into the core code of K8s. What K3s is doing is removing that, and that's allowing that smaller footprint on install. It's allowing a smaller footprint on runtime as well, because all of this stuff that's not required for most users has been pulled out. This is also something that full fat K8s is doing anyway, with the drives towards CSI driver and removing that code from the core Kubernetes. I think the difference between K8s and K3s is going to get smaller and smaller, because the philosophy behind K8s and K3s is the same. It's just K3s has taken that harsh sort of viewpoint of we'll just remove it today, whereas K8s has got to go through the depreciation cycle and take a few years to pull all of this out. And it's also reliant on people like Google and Azure and Alibaba pulling their existing code base out into CSI drivers and making sure that their business case works at the moment.
I think there's definitely going to be some more abstraction of Kubernetes. Already we're starting to see products being offered that automate a lot more of the responsibility that would normally be done by engineers to manage Kubernetes. That's being automated a lot more, and I think there's going to be some further abstraction towards more of a PaaS future. But at the same time, I think certain companies are going to always want that level of control, and it comes down to how opinionated service providers want to make their cloud infrastructure, because it's not a one size fits all. Large companies want more control around, say, security and things. Smaller companies want to trust their service provider to manage the security. So I think abstraction is going to be key to try and simplify Kubernetes and the way it's used for certain use cases. But at the same time, we've just got to make sure it works for everyone to a certain degree.
I think sort of my viewpoint is that Kubernetes is the buzz at the moment. There's a lot of news, there's a lot of traction because companies are adopting it at the moment, and there's a huge change in how you deploy to Kubernetes, how you develop for Kubernetes, because it's the right thing to do. There's a lot of noise around it at the moment, and there's a lot of articles. But if you look ahead 4 or 5 years, I see that buzz dying down. I see things like KubeCon getting a bit quieter, because it's just going to be the way it works. and the way things are developed and the way things happen. And sort of all of that buzz will die down, just because it'll just be the way it is. You don't hear about a conference about rack mount servers anymore, really, that you don't get a load of people turning up at that. So once the industry has moved towards this and they're just using Kubernetes as the standard, it'll be a really exciting time to look at what you can do on top of Kubernetes. Is it going to be now the next level of abstraction of, is it functions? And are there going to be a huge buzz around how do we get functions running properly? How do we orchestrate all of that together? And then, as Mark says about PaaS as well, of the business value is in getting your application out there. Whatever's running under the hood, you need to outsource to a provider, opinionated or not, and get your applications out there. So yeah, I don't think we're the death of Kubernetes yet, but the noise around it, I think, will slowly die down, and we'll moving on to the next level of abstraction.
But I guess it'll always be there, won't it? In the background.
Yeah, I think just like rack mount servers are always there. If say things are running in the cloud and you don't have to think about it, it's still running on hardware. There's still a CPU. There's still spinning disks. There are SSDs. That's there in the background, but you just don't have to talk about it. You don't have to think about it, because it's just the way things are done. You're moving on to, currently it's containerization, but how do you move on to FAS and then having, this thing is going to be really interesting with the reusable functions of why are there so many variations around how you do image compression. Realistically, as an industry, we need to get a single way of doing that. And then we're outsourcing every image compression to the same service that can then focus on the efficiencies and the scalability of that. And then, move on to the next thing. The Google Copilot project is a really good, the GitHub Copilot project is a really good example of that, of when you've got almost AI writing the code, or you're writing a comment of, I want a function to do this, or I want a business thing to do this image compression, or take this CSV of data and give me a load of aggregations on it. We don't need to be spending time working out how we deploy that. We want to call it, get my result, and use it to provide business value.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if machine learning is going to change the way Kubernetes is managed in terms of, as it becomes more sophisticated, and the sort of self-healing capabilities and configuration possibilities that are optimized by machines. I guess that's again when Kubernetes starts to be more in the background.
Yeah, and you look at scheduling at the moment, and it's fairly naive. Of, you've got, I want to run this pod, and there's an affinity or anti-affinity rule against that. You start getting into more complicated schedulers about, do I need a GPU attached, or how much CPU performance do I need? It could be really interesting if we're able to profile containers and go, right, this one actually is quite bursty, so I'll put it on this set of hardware. This application is very constant. It uses a constant amount of RAM and a constant amount of CPU. The scheduling requirements of that are very different, and enhancing Kubernetes to allow that scheduling and that knowledge of workload, that'll be also really, really interesting.